Welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I'm your host, Luke Sheehan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. Look at the numbers. The kids aren't all right. Record rates of anxiety and depression characterize the rising generation. But how? Parents are more involved than ever, taking their kids to dozens of activities, enrolling them in a plethora of programs, and ferrying them to myriads of appointments, practices, and games. That's how the Joneses do things, and we all know we must keep up with the Joneses. But what if the Joneses are wrong? Unfortunately, overparenting is just one way in which our culture has become unfriendly to families. I am joined by Tim Carney, author of Family Unfriendly: How Our Culture Makes Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. Tim Carney has been a columnist, author, and editor in Washington, D.C. for more than 20 years. He is senior columnist for the Washington Examiner and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His articles have been published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Post, Atlantic, Reason, National Review, and many other newspapers, websites, and magazines. He has appeared on Fox, MSNBC, CNN, PBS, and CNBC. Most relevantly to our conversation, he is the father of 6 and the husband of 1 wife. Tim, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Luke.
So let's start off. The thesis of your book is we have made having kids hard.
Yep.
Let's get into some reasons here. You start off actually with somewhat of a surprising phenomenon, and that is enrolling your kids in sports, and how that can get out of hand.
Yeah. Now, this is, I'm old enough. You said I've been around for 20 years, or almost just about 25 in DC. So I'm old enough that I get to tell the in my day type stories. So in my day, we rode our bikes to the Little League field, and our parents had to cut a check for about $100, inflation adjusted, whatever, $180. And they would come if they liked to come watch kids play baseball, and they wouldn't if they didn't. And it was local, and the coaches were all volunteer dads. And that was basically what we landed ourselves in suburban Maryland. We've recently moved to Virginia, but we lived in Montgomery County, Maryland for 16 years. And then at one point, against my better judgment, against my wife's better judgment, we enrolled our son in travel baseball. And the chapter 1 starts in the winter workouts. Now, again, this is Little League age. They're January, ice storm. They're in, this indoor baseball facility. And the first thing the coach says is, baseball isn't fun. Winning baseball is fun. To 11-year-olds. The median kid in that room was 11 years old and 101 pounds. Like, this is, and the team ended up stinking as part of the joke of the whole episode. The other joke was, I don't remember now whether I said it to my wife or she said it to me. She said, every bad thing that happens to Charlie is going to be good material for your book. Which is parents thinking that there was something at stake here besides just, fun, exercise, building virtues, baseball being a great game. The kids beginning to identify their self-worth with this sport into which their parents pour all their time and money. And I cite the studies about specializers and that sort of thing. And then I realized, looking around, that I wasn't the only one who sort of stumbled into this, that very few of these parents had set out, like Serena Williams' dad or something, to get their kid a D1 scholarship or make him rich as a baseball player. It just sort of seemed in the middle class suburbs of suburban Maryland and now in Northern Virginia, that's what you did. And you got told, oh, don't put your kid in the rec league. The coach is just some volunteer dad. And so the whole culture puts you towards this more intensive, expensive thing, which is a strain on the family and a strain on the children. So I talk about the falling birth rates and the childhood anxiety, and I think that they're connected to what I call the travel team trap.
Yeah, you talk about problems with it is the kids do get better at that sport, but it of course sidelines other sports they might play. We used to play a different sport every
Yes.
season. What sort of problems come out of that?
Well, and it, no time for going for walks with their brothers or mom or dad. No time for just idle fishing or a camping trip. Gosh, I talked to one kid. who, when he was asked what he was going to do in the summer, he's like, "Oh, we don't go on vacation." Even though, like, he was a kid who had a lake house. He's like, "Yeah, we don't have time because of baseball. Baseball takes up their whole life." So specialization, I think, does a lot of things wrong. One, just on a human level, it replaces a game with a job. Second, it's sort of a fatal conceit, right? It's a parents thinking that they have identified at age 11 or 12 where their kids' strengths are going to lie. So
Right.
I quote this music teacher saying how she wants to make sure kids have an expansive childhood. So her favorite piano player became a ballroom dancer and then a park ranger. And she feels like she succeeded, even though he never played piano after age 18. And so that expansiveness is rooted in a humility. Is saying, I don't know what my kid is going to be best at. I want them to be exposed to all sorts of things. And frankly, it's sort of part of human nature is to thrive when you're getting a range of activities. But sociological studies I looked at really pointed to very specific harms of the specializers. Kids who in high school played one sport for at least 10 months out of the year, more repetitive use injuries. The NBA commissioner said rookies are showing up with injuries that usually only veterans would have. But then a lower sense of self worth, even in the sport. So, how does it
Right.
happen even in the sport? It's because you keep on climbing a level. And eventually you get somewhere and you're like, Dad, just in Northern Virginia, there are 80 kids better than me in my age group at my position. And that's a good thing to realize, but not if, and this is again, I think the real harm, not if your parents have accidentally sent you the message that your self-worth is in this one thing in which they're investing all their time and money and all your family's money and time.
Right. Right. Yeah, I thought that I was especially surprised by the repetitive use injury thing. That's I mean,
Yeah.
that's a big deal. It ends up with what we know, whatever the sport is. Football players or soccer players end up with particular injuries, and we're in it with kids with those injuries. It's
Yes.
it's
No, and
absurd.
I follow these Twitter accounts about baseball, and they're like, "This kid, class of '26, throwing 91 miles an hour." It's like
Right.
doing my math is like he's 16 and he's
Right.
throwing 91. There's no way that's gonna last. Oh, we give him rest days. No, it also means if he's throwing 91, 9 times out of 10, that means he's not playing any other sport. And he's
Right.
not going hiking and he's not, reading for leisure or anything like that. All he
Right.
does is throw heat.
Right. Right. Uh, and you talk about, I mean, very few of these kids are going to be able to or want to continue with the sport. That's
Yeah.
another thing.
No,
Um,
the burnout, they quit.
yeah.
I never got to burn out. I was always like, "Wait, you could play in college and then you quit? Why'd you quit? Was it an injury?" They're like, "Oh, I got tired of it." I was blessed by not getting too tired of it, but I also talk about how it's not gonna work. There's gonna be some other kid who I talk about the goalie for the US men's hockey team who started playing goalie at some point in high school. So some other kid comes in and, like, his whole life is to be the varsity goalie, and he gets beat by the sophomore who just shows up and is a natural. Jacob DeGrom, one of my favorite pitchers, a former Met, the same thing. He was a shortstop, and then his junior year of college, his coach is like, "Why don't you try pitching?" And he goes ahead and he becomes the best pitcher in his school's history.
Well, there's it's a trap for it hurts the kids who do it and it hurts the kids who don't.
Yes.
Uh,
So by eroding the community. So my friend Michael Brendan Doherty wrote a piece, sort of in defense of travel team type things. Doherty's an excellent writer, and he has a daughter who does Irish dance, and he talks about how Irish dance is the only community they have because they don't know their neighbors, and so to have somebody you can call at the last minute for a favor for to pick up your kid, to have people that you're building lifelong connections and memories with, to have a group chat where you're sharing the foibles of parenting, he only has those because of this intensive activity he's doing. And if it's good to recognize that you need real human level community like that. But A, it's a crime if it doesn't exist in, the physically proximate world. But B, the intensive things undermine the local is part of my argument. that if you pull, and baseball's my sport again, if all the good pitchers don't play rec anymore, then gosh, it's, ball four, ball four, ball four, and it becomes a slog. And people like me, again, back in the 90s, I got to play along with and against future major leaguers or minor leaguers. There's
Right.
no way somebody of my, I was kind of fast. I could hustle. There's no way a scrappy kid not good at baseball like me would be able to play with these high level kids like that with all the specialization and the sorting.
And this is part of a larger problem of helicopter parenting, kind of over
Mhm.
parenting. What sort of other things do we do that are similar with similar negative outcomes for kids?
Yeah, well, so just in general, the overscheduling is bad, and then not letting them run around the neighborhood, and those are 2 sides. There's multiple reasons that parents don't let their kids run around the neighborhood. Some is they've come to believe that there's kidnappers around every corner, which is false. Some is there are actually new threats, which is if your kid shows up at some other kid's house, they might have the internet and, all the porn in the world or whatever unfiltered. Also, our places aren't built for kid walkability and bike ability. I mean, my kids do have a block, a couple blocks down that they can walk to, but certainly not after dark because there are no sidewalks. And it's just like, who built a suburb with no sidewalks? I'm pretty pro suburb. If you read Family Unfriendly, you'll see what I'm fighting for is suburbs that are better for parents to raise kids. In my old neighborhood in Maryland, we could see the grocery store from our front porch, but there was no way our kids could walk there because there was like an 8-lane county
Right.
highway in the middle. And so the built environment gets in the way of kids walking and biking around. And then you throw in that over parenting, over achievement obsession, and the kids end up with no time that they're just rambling,
Right.
no time that they get into trouble and have to figure out how to get out. They don't have
Right.
enough time where they're getting yelled at by a neighbor on the front porch because they did something really stupid. Like
Yeah.
that, all these formative experiences. And so I blame that along with psychiatrists and pediatricians I cite. I blame that for the epidemic of childhood anxiety, that they're not spending ages 6 through 14 sort of learning how to explore the world on their own.
Right. Um. Yeah. The walkability of neighborhoods. The fact that we built our environment for careers. That's basically it.
Well,
We didn't
and
build
for
them for people.
cars. Yeah,
Yeah.
for cars and careers.
Yeah.
And I don't even mind the bedroom community. I live right outside of DC. Unless you work at home, you ride the metro or drive into DC for, the white collar people in this neighborhood. Um, and so there's, I think that that's an acceptable, if unfortunate, price to pay. I think the key is the kids need to run around for,
Yeah.
and that when we built for cars because we were building for efficiency. There was an ideological decision that people are better off if everything is built around cars. And then as a parent, that means when they're little, you're like buckling and unbuckling and rebuckling. And when they're really little, they have that, like, 5-point harness, and the one that gets stuck under them, you have to dig your hand into this slurry of, like, chewed up goldfish crackers and butt sweat and spit up, and you have to do that, like, 4 times if you just wanna, like, visit your sister on the way to the hardware store. Like,
Right.
there's n and so that I call it car hell. That car hell is part of parenting, and it is not something that most parents choose, but it's something that our planners chose for us. Robert Moses is a famous stories, and I'm not an expert in how that all happened, but it was definitely something that was chosen for us was that we were going to live car dependent lives.
Right. Um. Another thing, well, this is related, is the importance of letting kids play, and wander around and having events wherein nothing's planned except for the barbecue.
Yeah, and that you again that there's not the overscheduling. I mean, with the millennials was the first time I had this. I never had this experience, but I did have uh, friends in journalism who said when they hired their first millennial writers, they the millennial writers were incredibly obedient, really serious, and always needed to be told what to do. And I think it's gotten worse
Yeah,
with the other thing. So boredom is one mother I quote said, "In our house, boredom is the muse." That is, kids will go and they'll make up their own game. They'll make
right.
up a card trick. Um, my kids started shooting each other with airsoft guns in the back because it's at the end of the summer because they didn't know what else to do. And we just, this wasn't something we planned for them or really played any role in. At one point, they were running low on ammo. I was like, A, don't use the fully automatic. That's dumb. But B, I will spend the $20 for a new bucket of ammo. But that was my only contribution to the whole thing. And that is, was I optimizing their enrichment in the weeks before school started? No. Maybe one day they'll need the sharpshooting for when the zombie apocalypse happens, but
Yeah, well, well, my dad was visiting one time, and my kids were, I think, was watching my daughter play soccer, and my son was just, you know,
mhm,
running around with other kids. And my dad kind of
yeah,
mentioned to me, is like, that was always the most fun for me when I was a kid, is when you were just at something and you were just messing around with nothing
yes.
planned. It was,
No,
uh,
for me, I remember, uh, it would be, weddings, because where, every 4th cousin, the reception was at a country club, and, oh, man, to be set free on a
right,
country club was like
right.
heaven. Definitely getting into trouble and having tons of fun.
All this overparenting has led to a baby bust, because you
Yes.
can't pour yourself into 6 kids in
Yep.
that way. Uh, Kind of work that out for us.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think the causality goes in both directions. I think when people have fewer kids, they're more likely to overparent. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post. I think it got the most negative comments in Washington Post history, saying you should have at least 4 kids. And not, to save the planet or whatever, but to make your life my original headline was make your life easier, have 4 kids. And then my son saw it and said, "What the hell, dad?" Because he's number 5. So I added in the at least, and they changed the headline to be the ideal number, which sounded kind of preachy to the readers who also think that overpopulation is a threat. Um, but I do think it goes in both directions. I think when people have fewer kids, they're more likely to overparent, in part because when you have more kids, you just the
Yeah,
joke is when you go from 2 to 3, you're going from man to man to zone defense.
right,
By the time you're at 5 and 6, you've, like, walked off the field, let the offense
right.
do whatever they're gonna do. And then but I also do think that I did a focus group, and some of the people who said, "I don't have kids, I kinda would like to, but I'm not sure I'm actually going to." Some of what they said is, "I want to make sure I give my kids the best of absolutely everything, and that I don't miss a single, little league game or parent teacher conference." And these are great aspirations, but if they're seen to be the bare minimum, then you're going to undermine it. And yeah, so the baby bust. I mean, we could just talk about the numbers here. When the first year when we had our first kid, there were 4.3 million babies born in the United States, and the total fertility rate was a little bit above 2.1. So the total fertility rate is kind of the best measure of the birth rate. It's how many babies women are having over their whole life. 2.1 is a replacement level at which a population will remain steady. And so we were slightly above that with a little uptick in 2006 and 2007, and since then, it's dropped basically every year. And the total fertility rate is about 1.6 now. Number of babies born fell from 4.3 to 3.6 million. And so this has been going on for 15 years. So the result is there are actually fewer kids in America today than a decade ago, not just as a percentage of the population, but it's actually shrinking. The
Right.
world has hit peak baby, meaning we might never have as many babies again as we did a few years ago. And the US hit peak baby in 2007. And I don't think it's going to turn around. I think that falling birth rates beget falling birth rates. That's
Right.
what we've seen in most other countries. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And so that's a problem. It's a real big problem.
There was, let's talk about government policies. Governments have tried to, turn the
Hmm.
ship around, and not with very little success. What have they tried, and to what
Yeah.
extent have all these everything they tried failed?
So there's a lot of different types of attempts. The I think the least successful was Northern Europe. What they realized was that the biggest competitor with family was work. And they decided, oh, well, people aren't having kids because they don't have childcare. So let's do universal childcare. And this will liberate people to have kids and they can hand their kids off to the childcare and they can focus on their careers. What you ended up with, and I point to polls about how Northern Europe, how the millennials and the Gen Z there are now so much more obsessed with work than their parents or grandparents were. So childcare subsidies are work subsidies, is what they are. And the other approach, I mean, China's trying everything. I think they were pretty effective at driving down the birth rate. They've had no luck in driving the birth rate back up. And France really just gives a ton of money, like a ton of money to parents for being parents. There's even a paid leave program, which is basically a stay at home mom benefit. My wife has stayed home for uh, 18 years. And I think for the first 15 of that, until our youngest was 3, she would have been getting paid by the government if we lived in France, a salary for being a stay-at-home mom. Now, again, it was called paid leave, and, the whoever her employer was would have had to hold her job open for 15 years for her. Um, and they also tons of direct money, a baby bonus, sure, a monthly baby allowance, sure. They do have, subsidized childcare, all of that it does seem to drive up the birth rate. France has the highest birth rate in Europe consistently. And even if you took away every immigrant in France, the numbers, at least when I was writing Family Unfriendly, if you took away every immigrant in France, they would still have the highest birth rate. Hungary is the other one that famously tried this. That whole part of the continent had a plummeting birth rate, and they instituted all sorts of benefits, and they successfully arrested it the fall. There were some upticks, there's evidence that it's falling again. They do things like if you have a 4th kid, you never pay income taxes again. Um, but I think what they've shown is 2 things. All of these. The If you throw a ton of money at people for having kids, you'll get a few more babies. It'll be really expensive. But the Hungary experiment, I think, and this is me reading between the lines, I think it shows something very particular. That it might artificially increase the statistical birth rate because it helps people have kids sooner if you give them money, if you give them daycare. So that's fine. That's good. Like if somebody wants 2 kids and they have them 4 years apart, that's not as good as they want 2 kids and they have them, 18, 24 months apart. That's great if you can do that. But it doesn't drive up the ultimate number of births, except, and again, this is me reading between the lines, I think among basically religious people, family-oriented people who want a ton of kids, there's a subset of them who really are constrained by their housing situation. Like, if I could afford to live across the street from my mom who could help with the kids, I would have more kids. So a small portion of the population really is constrained, and it's mostly, in my opinion, about homeownership. The affordability explanation, I spent a lot of time on saying how affordability doesn't matter nearly as much as people think in the baby bust. But so these governments have tried all these things, not a lot of success, except in speeding up the tempo of births and to some extent helping working class religious couples have a 3rd or 4th kid. So that's something, but it's not going to meaningfully move the total fertility rate in a country that's all of these countries are mostly secular, and it's not going to meaningfully move the total fertility rate.
Right. There's a couple other negatives here. We could continue on and on
Yeah, yeah,
about
yeah.
negatives, but I was admittedly a little on the fence on the tradwife phenomenon,
Yeah.
and you kind of pushed me over into the negative side. So let's talk about momfluencers.
Momfluencers. So it's so funny that you use this term tradwife, traditionalist, you're
Mm.
thinking natural, and it's in an entirely online phenomenon. And I think it used to mean something more before. Words change their meaning a lot faster Neologisms change their meaning so fast in the age of social media. A word gets invented, it's kind of interesting, and then 8 years later, it's lost its interest and it's broadened out. So tradwife can mean anything from a woman who is actually like a beauty model making explaining that she makes cornflakes from scratch for her kids' breakfast. My wife's like, "These kids are gonna starve to death if they have to wait for their breakfast to be done." Um, to, a Mormon family that, by the way, is like inherited millions of dollars and has is using their influence to sell their meat, and their kids always look perfect. To there's all sorts of things. To women lecturing how other women how you need complete obedience to your husband and da da da, and you should wear heels while doing the chores around the house. There's all sorts of things that fit into the trad wife thing. Um, I'm told that my wife is a trad wife because she doesn't work for pay except substitute teaching.
Mm.
Um, and I have not gotten homemade cornflakes for my kids yet, despite this. But so the negatives of this are pretty serious.
Right.
One, it's not just that they make everything look perfect, it's that they make everything look perfect and effortless. And
Right.
this is dispiriting. You
Right.
might think that that's aspirational, but there's a lot of psychiatric studies explain that women in particular, the way they engage with social media is social comparison. And so I point out how like these obviously immensely manicured, cultivated shots with a professional photographer, with stylists, with hours are made to look like they just happen on the back porch. Like, oh, look, that kid's wearing his socks outside. LOL, they're wearing jeans. And then you notice when you look closer, like there's a spectrum of hues that perfectly slope to match the trad wife's blue eyes. And
Right.
so all of that. And then the flip side though, the besides the momfluencer setting these insane expectations, is the parenting is hell part of social media. And that I think that that really has hit a lot of Gen Z hard. Like where a lot of millennials are like, "Oh, I'd like to have kids. I don't think it's in the cards." I worry that, the kids coming out of college now are increasingly going to say, "Why the heck would I have kids?" Because again, low birth rates beget lower birth rates.
Right. Yeah, it's always there's like a religious version of this. So sometimes you'll see religious people talking about it and they're like, "Oh, family's so hard and it's so this and it's so that." And it's like, you have 5 kids, like, surely there's lots of joy. I mean, would you trade a single kid?
No.
No,
Yeah.
no. And so say that, tell people that. I'm
Yeah.
reminded I saw this heard this woman give an interview, and I can't remember her name, but she's a doctor and she's involved with a Catholic council on something.
Mhm.
And she said and she gave this account of, when my son was born, her first was born, and she said, and they put me in her arms. The first thing I thought is, why didn't anyone tell me how amazing this is? Like, no one told me, like, it's the most amazing thing ever, you know? And I still remember, like, the moment my wife told me she was pregnant with the first one, like, that minute when I knew, the
Yeah.
second when I knew I was a father,
No,
nothing
and
compares.
the thing is though that why didn't anybody tell me? This fits into how it's culturally reinforcing. Um, my wife didn't need to be told. She had
Yeah,
4 younger siblings and then had a couple of friends who and these are like the college kids now. A couple of our oldest is a high school senior. So a couple of friends who had a baby somewhere like pretty close friends, somewhere from 3 years to just before we got married. So it was in the air. And I use that term in the book. I say pregnancy is contagious.
yeah,
And that idea of like holding a baby and how magical it is, you couldn't avoid it in our social circles. And then imagine the average Brooklyn 28-year-old who, if he has any friends who are married, none of them have kids yet. And the
right,
social life is built around Sunday brunch, which goes out the window with the baby. And so, and yeah, there are people who just said, I mean, again and again, and I don't harp on this, but um, who just really feel they were lied to. A lot of it is women who feminism, careerism lied to them. There's one letter writer to the Wall Street Journal who said he read in 1968 that the world was overpopulated. And so he never had kids, and it's the deepest regret of his life. And I was like, wow, I mean, that's not surprising, but it's really unnerving.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's yeah, I think there's a lot to that because I was thinking for me, it always seemed obvious I'd have kids, but I have one younger brother and one older brother, so it's not like I was from a big family, but
Yeah.
I have lots of cousins, and so there's
Yeah.
always people, right?
Yes.
And they were coming along, as I was growing up, so it
No,
seemed
and
obvious.
the end of Cousins, there's been a couple
Yeah.
pieces. The Atlantic had a piece on this, um, in Korea, most people don't have a sibling and half of the people don't have a cousin.
Mm.
And it's totally wild. And so for my kids to have these cousins who are these sort of like best friends, safety valve, da 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 da. You're at a party, some other guy's being creepy. You know that your older cousin is going to come over and make sure that
Right.
everything goes well.
Right. Right, well, and it is kind of one of these things I've been thinking about is, I guess Catherine Pakaluk talks about, you have more kids, and that's a gift to your kids is they have each other. That's a pretty big gift.
Absolutely. The
Now
best thing
it's
you can give your kids is more siblings. So yeah.
and then you're giving a gift to your grandkids of cousins. That's gonna
That's
happen too. So,
a good way to put it. Yeah.
yeah, and so it's, yeah, and that's something that's really, really lost. Um, and we could continue with lots of negative things because the picture's a little dark. But let's get into some things have you talk about the problem being kind of ultimately cultural. I mean, the
Yeah.
governments try a lot of things and they're really like, I think my favorite is when the government policies are defended and they'll be like, the birth rate increased by 30%, by which they meant it went from like 1.1 to
Yeah.
1.4. Like,
Yeah.
it's not exactly turned to the ship around. But there are some places, Georgia, for example,
Yes.
the country, not the state. What happens in Georgia?
In Georgia, they like the rest of, the Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, etc. They saw their birth rate falling, and they are an Orthodox country. And the patriarch of the country said, if you have a third child, a fourth child, or beyond, I personally will baptize them. And so this caused the birth rate to go up. It specifically increased marital births by 40%, and it increased third births by 100%. There were twice as many moms with 3 kids after this, as there had been before that. And that was, again, it was totally cultural. And so Lyman Stone is a demographer, and he shows up in about like 20 of my endnotes in Family Unfriendly. But he just sort of drilled down even deeper on this, and he thinks he's established that this was definitely causal. And so that's a unique situation, unfortunately.
Right.
If whoever the next pope is of the Catholic Church, even if he said, I will personally baptize every, just in Italy, every third child born in Italy, I don't know that that would have a huge impact. You can't think of like a mega church leader who would have a but maybe on a local level, you could,
Right. Right.
on somebody who's really big across Western Iowa could do that. But the broader lesson to draw out of that is that it's cultural, that religion is definitely going to be involved in this. I've used some numbers to suggest that basically the secularization of the United States can explain almost the entirety of the baby bust here. Um, and that the word vibes gets thrown around a lot today, but if you get the right things in order, you can in fact shift the vibes. And so people I don't think that telling people Social Security is going under, you need to have kids. I don't think that that works.
Right.
What I try to do in this book is to make parenting look fun. I admit at the end that it's going to be the hardest thing you ever do, but it's worthwhile. Um, and just inspire people that in a world with more parents and more kids, we're all sort of happier. And so it's going to take, again, I don't know of any Catholic bishops who could pull this off, or certainly I can't think of any Protestant, Episcopalian bishops. But with art, with culture, we can portray parenting in a way that's appealing. The problem is what we're trying to overcome is an anthropology. Like in Georgia, it was a largely religious country. And so here you have recent great writers talk about um, expressive individualism. I don't use that term that much in my book, but just the idea that like you are fundamentally an atomized, free floating bundle of rights. If that is the view of the self, really, we're asking you, and this is what Catherine McCulloch says in Hannah's Children. We're asking you to find your joy and meaning in sacrifice for others. Well, that sounds like the patriarchy to
Right.
to a lot of the
Right.
world. So I do think you have to change the culture, but I think it's a multi-step and like the idea that sacrifice for others and that we're fundamentally relational, that's the first argument that needs to be made.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's I think that the idea of the, expressive individualism, it's called different things, but we're just rights bearing beings, and that's the way we are in our essence.
Yeah.
Anything that impinges on that, voluntary, not
Well,
involuntary, but especially even voluntary things that impinge on that are that.
and
Um,
and
s-
that and that we're family is fundamentally unchosen.
right,
Like,
right, right.
and I quoted Charles Lehman, who's it's funny, he's a dad, he's basically secular Jewish, but he said, "Every child has always been unchosen and unplanned because you may have decided this is the right month to have a baby, but you didn't get to pick this baby."
Right.
Now, maybe with, the future of IVF, that'll change in some way, but it won't, right? If you believe in the human soul, it won't change that. But you didn't get to choose this baby. So I tell um, the story of when our baby was born, and I looked at her and I thought, she's a stranger. What the I've never met her before.
Right.
I'm supposed to like, I already named her. I built a crib for her, and I don't even know her. And I said, picking a roommate for 18 years whom you've never met before is not like a rationalist planner thing to do.
Right.
And then you're imposing the people who think that family is inherently oppression. It's because anything that's not uh, because if consent is your only threshold, the only thing that makes something right or wrong, well, you didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose to live in that house. You certainly didn't choose your siblings. Um, and so family is one big, long thing of unchosen obligations. And that's something that you have to overcome in this society is to say, maybe unchosen obligations can be good for you.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, even your spouse is it's a choice, but you
You
don't
don't
get it
get to
back out.
you don't get to remake it every day. Yes.
Right. Right. And it's yeah, it's a big problem. And it seems to me it's, that idea that anthropology's been around for a while, but it took a while to soak in, right? Every generation seems to have gotten to
Yes.
absorbed it even more and even
Without even thinking. I mean, when I said online on Twitter, I said, some of us don't see marriage as a simple bilateral contract between the husband and the wife, but it is in fact a covenant made with the broader community, with all of society, and reciprocal duties between society and the couple and society. And the response wasn't, "Oh, I don't agree with that." Most of the response I got on Twitter was, "What the heck are you talking about? That's the craziest thing I've ever known." Because the transactionalism embedded in that individualism is just it's taken for granted. It's seen as this is what human nature is that, a relationship is just, a slightly complex set of transactions. And that we fundamentally consensual transactions is what human interaction is.
right. Yeah, it's I read this article recently and I was on people who didn't want kids. But what's interesting about it is they were talking about like, well, my parents would take me on travel soccer. And man, they put a lot of work into me, and I just can't imagine putting that much work into my own kids. So I'm not gonna have kids. It was just like, what? They didn't get out of it like, it was really fun going with my
Yeah.
family on places, and I wanna do the same thing with my kids. It was the opposite of that. It was purely like selfish, right? Wow,
Yeah.
man, that sounds like a lot of work. And I saw my parents put in work and I don't wanna do the work. So I'm gonna go to brunch.
Yeah, two kinds of people, those who have kids and those who have brunch.
That's right. Uh, and it's kinda funny. And after you have kids, like, you think you're gonna miss the brunch, but you don't miss it as much. Like, I
No.
just don't miss it that much. It's kind of a funny thing.
Yeah.
We have some other issues. You brought up workism,
Mhm.
and I think what you're getting at is it's where we put the social status, and your social status is whatever that resume says. That's where
Yeah.
entirely where we put it.
Well, and, I think it fits into the secularization of our culture because I quote, Derek, Thompson, who's I don't know what his, faith or religion is, but he's an excellent writer for The Atlantic, and he's written about that there are many atheisms in our new secular age, that the people who give up on God, replace it with a godless religion, and that workism is a dominant one in the US. And so part of it is finding meaning in work beyond where it's appropriate. Now, I mean, you and I we're very blessed. The work we do is not just it's not and work shouldn't again simply a transaction. A lot of people really believe it should be. It should be I give my boss labor, my boss gives me money and health insurance. But ideally, your work is something more. And I don't need to convince you or this audience of that. But that doesn't mean it should be everything. And so, how do we define ourselves? My boss at AI, Yuval Levin, says sort of there's an older way of thinking about it that within certain that you belong to institutions and you play roles within institutions. And that kind of constellation of roles and institutions is who you are. And that workism is where your employment is just dominates all of those other things. So your religion, your neighborhood, your family relations, that they all take second place. One of the things I argue in the book is that the push for universal childcare reinforces workism. I was talking about Northern Europe where that happens. And also, again, it's a very competitive environment. And so I had a guy at a New York breakfast where I was talking about this book, and I talked about how, we should spend more time with our kids, worry a little less about our work, and also spend more time ignoring our kids too.
Right.
But he just said, I just think you don't understand what it's like here on Wall Street. If I go home at 7 p.m., the guy across the street is going to get the deal that I could have gotten.
Right.
And I think there's always gonna be some set of the population that is that sort of killer instinct, super driven. It's not even necessarily about money, and that's fine. And I'd say those people aren't called to marriage and parenthood.
Right.
But then it
That's right.
triggers out where the culture tells you that that's what you're supposed to be. And so I try to argue against workism, against certainly against a feminist workism, but also I argue that, maybe the allies, workplace allies that feminists need are the dads who say, "Hey, I gotta leave at 5:30. I gotta go home for dinner."
Right. Yep. Yeah, I liked that part of it. Because I think a big problem is that, we had the Industrial Revolution. All of which is great. Technology is great, but the dads are off at the factory for 15
Yeah.
hours, and the dads are in the car driving to into the city from the suburbs for gone for 12 hours, and then that's the model. That's what you do,
Yeah.
and it's
So
you
one
don't
way to look at this is maybe we never quite adjusted, and this is what a lot of conservatives say. We never quite adjusted to the post-agrarian economy.
Right.
Like work and home wasn't a separate thing.
Right,
Like
right,
making your kids do their chores for me is has nothing. It gets in the way of my work. If I were
right,
a farmer, it'd be the same thing.
right,
Though, and then there are some feminists who argue fairly convincingly that the Industrial Revolution, um, by making the domestic sphere have nothing to do with making money, then you throw on how modern man uses money as like a scorecard of your success,
mm,
that actually led to a diminution of the work of stay-at-home moms.
right,
Because and I mean, I cannot tell you how many times, even in Catholic, even in conservative circles, somebody when they ask my wife what she does, and she says, "I stay home and I raise 6 kids." It is not anywhere close to a majority, but, it regularly happens that
right,
somebody makes it clear, like, "This conversation's over. We have nothing
right,
to
right,
talk about."
right. Yeah, 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 I think it's a bit of a travesty, and I like the idea of, like, I mean, it's dare I say it, patriarchal, where the father says, "No, I'm going home. That's the family comes first. That's my first identity as my father, my
And
role as
every
father."
every employer I've had, because I've basically worked in conservative institutions, so the Washington Examiner, American Enterprise Institute, I worked for Bob Novak, they all made it clear that family comes first. I
Right.
had an editor walk in one day, and I think his son had just gotten engaged, and he said, "Tim, you might accomplish a lot in your career, but it will all pale in comparison to the meaning you get from family, from your
That's
wife
right.
and your kids." And just to have your boss say that
Right.
was so powerful. I was a boss for a brief period at the Examiner, and I always said that family first, family first. And in fact, we're going to explicitly accommodate family more than we accommodate other things.
Right.
This might be discrimination. It is, in a literal sense of the word discrimination. But if you say, I'm getting a new cat, I want to take the whole week off. Like,
Right.
no,
Right.
like take Friday off before a long weekend. All right. If you say my daughter's in the hospital, I'm not going to be able to work today. I say, all right,
Take the week.
I'll pray for her, take off as much time as you need.
Right.
And that this is um, actually preferring, accommodating the thing that we think is more valuable,
Right.
which again grates on the sort of spirit of the age where, well, if everybody's choosing what's of value to them, who are you as an employer to say choosing family is better than choosing Premier League soccer?
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, my wife was, uh, at, this job she was looking at, she asked about having the kids there, if they after
Yeah.
school or something like that, and the boss was like, "There's a woman who works there, and she homeschools her kids, and she works there, so they're just there all the time." And he's okay with it, so he's like, "Yeah, it's not a problem."
And this is the sort of thing like when big businesses think about how to be a family friendly employer, all they think about is parental leave, which is great. I love
Right.
maternity leave. If you want to throw in paternity leave, that's fine. Though if mine were too long, my wife would make me get another job. But I especially with each subsequent kid, I took time off to take care of the older ones while my wife took care of the baby. Those things are great. Universal childcare, as I've suggested earlier, it's the childcare as a benefit is very overrated. Um, but, especially for a single mom, it would be very incredibly valuable to be like, "And we're going to give you, like, on-site childcare." That would be incredibly valuable. But the sort of informal workplace childcare you're talking about or flexibility. So I cite the Nobel Prize winning economist Claudia Goldin. She's a feminist, great economist, argued that the pay gap that exists between men and women is entirely because mothers demand flexibility more than childless women and more than men, including dads. So again, Northern Europe's reaction to this is, oh, let's relieve them of demanding workplace flexibility by just giving them
Right?
50 hours a week of childcare. Maybe some of them want to spend time with their kids.
Right.
And so my argument in the book and looking at stats, I think if every American mother got to snap her fingers and have the job she wanted, especially when their kids are school age, it would be to work 20 to 30 hours a week and be home both when the school bus picks off and when it drops off. So that might mean working from home. That might mean, again, having a 9 to 2 job instead of a 9 to 5. Um, there's all sorts of things. It might mean, and some of this, maybe we have to change the labor laws. Maybe we need to change occupational licensing laws to make it easier. I knew this woman who sold fudge out of her kitchen because she was a stay-at-home mom and she had little
Right.
kids and she could schedule everything around baking fudge. And it was definitely illegal for her to sell fudge out of the kitchen. Um, but and then as employers and educators to train people who want to be parents, hey, here's a job that's more flexible. Here's a job that's family friendly. That's a field where if you go down that line, it's really hard to land a family friendly thing. If you do become an attorney, here's what you need to realize the sort of hours that kind of attorney works versus this. And
Right.
doctors actually really get this very clearly because they do, I don't know what it's called, the sort of the tours of duty in different fields. And they realize, oh, pediatrics is sort of built for moms, and so it's super flexible. Radiology, nowadays you just do it from home. It's perfect
Right.
for a parent to be family friendly. But that idea to the extent that we're guiding people towards careers, tell people, hey, by the way, if you want to get married and have kids, this line of work is going to be a lot more amenable.
Right. Right. Yeah, the big problem with this is that we've been circling is the cultural nature of it. You gotta have
Hmm.
a culture where there are people who love kids, and then people have more kids, and then you get more love for kids. It's kind of grows.
Well,
Uh,
the example I give in the book is Israel.
right.
Um,
Yes.
Israel has a birth rate of 3.0 compared to Europe 1.5, US 1.6. Obviously, a lot of that is religion. God's first commandment was be fruitful and multiply. And one of the first guys I interviewed in Jerusalem, that's what he just said. He has 4 kids. I said, why do Israelis have so many kids? He said, mitzvah, be fruitful and multiply. But then I traveled over when I was doing the reporting for this book to Tel Aviv, and they're basically the first 2 people I met said, we have 3 kids, and as one guy put it, God had no role in our family planning. In other words, he was secular, agnostic, but he also said, well, Israel supports you. And a lot of people didn't even notice all the ways in which it happened. But, if they build a new housing development, there's going to be like a little enclosed tot lot for the little kids, and there's going to be room for the older kids to run around.
Right.
It's going to be built with balconies overlooking the room so that mom can shout, hey, come on in. I mean, Tel Aviv is not sprawling. It has a huge real estate crisis, and people are still having all these babies. And all of these accommodations for families trickle out way outside of the religious world. And so the birth rate for secular Jews in Israel is 2.0 babies per woman. Again, all of the US is like 1.62. Probably church going mainline Protestants in the US are below 2.0. Secular Americans of all stripes are probably below 1. But the secular Jews in Israel have 2.0 babies. Why is that? It's because the culture sort of sets the norm. It's normal to have kids. Your friends are probably having kids. If you're out at a restaurant, there's other people's kids there.
Right.
And then there will be like specific accommodations, but some of it is just what's normal. And so
Right.
the US does have subcultures like that. I mean, I talk about my
Right.
the friend circles that I inherited from my wife, talk about the Mormons. And so the US does have subcultures like that. And so when people ask, how do we turn this around? I say, we got to just build bit by bit, build more subcultures like that.
Right. All right. Well, Tim, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our sponsors, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman through the Kirk Center website at kirkcenter.org/donate. Go to kirkcenter.org/permanent-things to sign up for the Kirk Center website email list. And I'll see you next time on the Book Gallery.